Greetings and welcome back to room 303 of the Harvard Classic Lectures. This is lecture number 49 of the Harvard Classics Lectures. We'll be talking about Emerson's essay, Nature. Now right away it's significant for your notes that you want to write this down. We are here talking about Emerson's essay, Nature, from 1844. Emerson actually wrote two essays that he called Nature. The first is often not referred to as an essay, it's actually referred to as a book or even a book-length essay because it's quite longer, and it's the 1836 essay, book-length essay called Nature. Now this one was the significant moment at the beginning of Emerson's rise in popularity and of course his iconoclastic tendencies towards changing the world around him through the prose that he would write. We will not see this essay in particularly Volume 5 of the Harvard Classics. It's long, and so they elected to put English traits as the longer piece of Emerson's instead of Nature. However, I'll go ahead later and be giving a full lecture on the essay from 1836. This is the 1844 published second series of essays published in 1844, Emerson's Nature. Now, just to remind, if you haven't been following my stuff, you need to hit learnstrong.net, go down that left-hand side, and make sure that you at least find the folder called the Harvard Classics and watch lecture number 35, which is the Intro to Emerson. There we said the following, just to remind. We are studying Emerson from three primary perspectives. One, Emerson as person, as teacher, okay, talking about his biography and the importance of the way in which he sees the world through his life's biography. Two, we'll look at Emerson always from the perspective of philosopher, idealist. We less like to use the term transcendentalist as it relates to Emerson, simply because he himself was a little bit dubious about that term, transcendentalism. He liked the term idealism for reasons that we will actually see articulated in this very essay, Nature. Finally, number three, we're going to see Emerson as the artistic genius, the creator that he was. He, of course, really does kind of set the bar for what truly great prose looks like. This, of course, in our reading theory is level 2B, rhetorical, not what Emerson says, but how he says it. Just to remind, our learning theory in all of these lectures, and of course our work in 303, is to always define learning as the capacity to connect new information with old information. So it really doesn't matter what Emerson has to say about nature if you somehow can't relate to it in some meaningful way. So we'll be challenging ourselves to do that. Of course, we do that through our three levels of reading. Let's review quickly. At level 1, we summarize whatever it is that's being said. So for example, we'll play the game with the 16 paragraphs of this essay to try and summarize. At level 2, we don't ask the question, what does the text say, but rather, what does the text mean? And in that regards, we subdivide into two different sections. At 2A, what does the text mean in regards to themes, messages, and the like? At 2B, we ask the rhetorical question, as we were just commenting about. Not what Emerson says, but rather how Emerson says it. Finally, at level 3, we're answering the question, how can I relate to this text? Here we subdivide again. At 3A, how can I relate to other texts that I know of? And of course the world. And then finally at level 3B, the most important level for our reading, because that's what we want is learning, is how do I relate to this personally? Now a bit of background information before we get started. Again, Emerson will in many ways launch his career with an essay called Nature, but again it's not this essay. In 1836 he pretty much changes much of the terrain of intellectual thought with that classic famous essay, which is not included in the Harvard Classics volume number 5, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about it, as I said, later. This essay published 8 years later in 1844, and it's always fascinating, and this is a 3A observation already, it's always fascinating to study the ways in which Emerson's ideas and his kind of observations about nature are going to have evolved in those 8 years. No question, he's going to say some more innovative kinds of things in this newer essay called Nature. Now, to understand this essay, we're going to go back to an idea that we've been talking about often in our conversations with Emerson. You have to appreciate your Plato, and more particularly, you need to know Plato's theory of the forms. Just to review, we will put two boxes on our whiteboard. I won't even do this now because I've done it so often in other lectures that I hope this will be just for you a mnemonic and a review. Two boxes on our whiteboard. Again, this comes from Plato's Republic, book number 6, and of course the famous cave allegory of book 7, okay? And I've given full lectures on this as well at Learn Strong. If you're interested, you can go and find that information as well. Those two boxes are going to represent for Plato, and certainly for Emerson, a very important dualistic way of looking at the world. Although we will argue in this essay that Emerson will move from dualism to monism, that is to say, from seeing the world as two to seeing the world as one. I mean, if I were to flip a quarter at you and ask you, is it one or is it two? Your instinct would be to answer that it's one, unless I throw 2 quarters at you. But if I were to point out that there's 2 sides to that coin, right, the old cliche, there's 2 sides to that coin, making the coin now not 1 but 2. This is what we mean by moving from dualism to monism. Well, what is this dualism? Well, quite simply, if you're talking about yourself, it is that you have a physical body. We will put that in the first box. Above the first box, we will put the physical. Above the second box, we will put the meta, or the beyond the physical. Okay? We can, for example, talk about, as we've said already, a beautiful body, for example, in the first box. But we will talk in the second box about a concept called beauty. Now, of course, you can't actually touch beauty. You can only reference it as a concept. Okay? That idea, again, we can just review quickly. That idea gets played out again and again. So, for example, we can talk about money in the first box, value in the second box. We can talk about the exchange of fluids in the first box. We can talk about love in the second box. And on and on and on we can go. All right? Now, for Emerson, his most important question is, what are we going to do with Ruthie's tree? Plant it out there. We reference it often in our lectures, right? What are we going to do with that tree? Well, everything in the first box related to the 5 senses and physical, and therefore we're going to put Ruthie's tree in the first box. But for Emerson, he's going to ask, well, what will go in the second box? Well, in the same way that we can talk about you as an individual that is physical, you can also talk about you as an individual that is somehow special because of, now the language starts to get fuzzy, both for Emerson, as well as for Plato, Socrates, as well as for us. What are you going to call that other you? Not the body you, but that other you. Well, there's different words. We can call it mind, we can call it soul, we can call it consciousness, we can call it spirit. Today, probably, the most comfortable term that we'll use is energy. In other words, we will say about you that you are fundamentally energy. And yet that consciousness piece is always one that's going to be problematic for us. What makes you somehow special, in other words? Well, for Emerson, that is no throwaway question, because Emerson also knew his Aristotle. Remember, Aristotle, the student of Plato. Aristotle said it this way: the difference between you and your dog, or you and your cat, or you and any other kind of life force on this planet that's non-human, is that your dog and you both can look at the sunset. But only one of the two of you will actually be able to appreciate the sunset. The appreciation of beauty is something fundamental to being human, and for Aristotle and his classic text, Poetics, we've spoken about this elsewhere, that's what makes your viewing of literary and your study of literary text or any other kind of text so important, because humans have this important capacity to appreciate this thing we call beauty, as opposed to simply looking at something. Well, with this in mind, then, we're going to turn to the question of what is up with tree huggers. Now, obviously, I'm asking this question in some kind of, euphemistic way, but let's go ahead and ask it. What is up with tree huggers, or environmentalists, or people who are always talking about how important nature is? Obviously, Emerson's going to do this in this essay. We mustn't make the mistake of believing that Emerson is a worshiper of nature in the first box. This is huge for your notes. And the misunderstandings of Emerson, his transcendentalism, especially as it relates to his naturalism, is often rooted here. This misunderstanding is rooted in the very distinction I'm making. Emerson loves trees, but the reason that he loves trees is not because they're trees. What he loves about trees is that there is a second view of that tree, of Ruthie's tree, as we have said many times. Why? Because you can talk about nature in the first box, lowercase n, or you can talk about nature in the second box, uppercase n. That is to say, Ruthie's tree, just like you, is energy. And what do we say about energy? And again, for Emerson, this is hypercritical for his understanding. Energy is, of course, that which can be neither created nor destroyed. In other words, it doesn't exist. No, it definitely exists. Look, there it is. You can see it. I thought you just said it can't be created or destroyed. So how do you even constitute its existence at all? That will be a very interesting question for Emerson. And it'll be one that he's constantly trying to share. Now, about that notion, Emerson will ask this question: where do notions of morals and ethics come from? Of course, he's going to argue those ideas of morals and ethics are a part of that second box. In other words, you really can't, give me 3 pounds of truth. Give me 15 ounces of justice. No. In fact, that's what makes, of course, that classic scene in Shakespeare's, that notion of the whole exchange of the body parts, right? Okay, I'm going to give you a certain part out of my body, right? And that will allow for the exchange to be, no. We understand the merchant. This doesn't work this way, does it? In other words, you can't weigh justice, even with body parts, right? Well, then there is no justice. No. There is definitely justice. There is definitely morals. There's definitely ethics. Well, then where do they come from and how do we derive them? Emerson's answer, hypercritical, Emerson's answer as an idealist is that all moral sentiment is born of this understanding of the second box. That is to say, beauty, truth, justice, all those other concepts that make the most important part of our lives, again to go back, right before an individual dies, Socrates says, go back to my Phaedo lecture in the Harvard Classics, right before an individual dies, Plato will argue that all humans say, oh my God, the only question is the inflection of the voice. In other words, there's something we understand is really important when we come to the end of our life, and it's got virtually nothing to do with that first box. Dude, you can have millions of dollars, the first box, and you can come to the end of your life and recognize that your life has been valueless. How is that possible if you got millions of dollars? Because I thought millions of dollars was a great value. Not when you're 5 seconds from flatlining. That idea, that intuition, is going to be central to how Emerson will understand his perception of nature. So, in the poem, while he's celebrating trees, rocks, mountains, sky, understand that what he's really celebrating, standing behind that celebration, is his appreciation for the second box, nature in the second box. The easy euphemism for us to use now for the rest of the lecture and going forward is nature with a capital N, okay? As opposed to, again, nature with the lowercase. Another way to say this is, as we've said many, many times in 303, the only real difference fundamentally between you and a fly is you know about fly swatters. That is no throwaway line for Emerson, by the way. In other words, what do we mean by that? Well, you are aware that you exist. Going back to an earlier lecture, you're aware that you have consciousness. You can be aware that you are thinking right now. That capacity to be aware for Emerson is fundamental to understanding what makes you special. And that makes you different from flies, because flies don't know about fly swatters. In other words, you are a species, you are a being that understands you're only here for a short period of time. Again, you've never met no 200-year-old person. That is an important insight for Emerson, and he says because that's an important insight, because you realize that, you begin to ask questions about your own mortality, or your immortality. Because if you are energy, and energy is that which can be neither created nor destroyed, there is no death. There's death, of course, in the first box, but there is no death in the second box. This notion of the immortality of the soul, central, of course, for Emerson's reading and study of Plato's classic essay, the Phaedo, as we've given earlier lectures. Now, I wish, as I've said before, that I could just read this entire essay to you, but it's too long. So we're going to have to pick and choose what it is that we're going to concentrate on. Let's go ahead and ask that you number the 16 paragraphs of the essay as you're studying it, and then I'll reference it paragraph by paragraph. The essay itself will begin with a few lines of poetry that Emerson has written, and I'll just read a couple of the lines because they're kind of classic. He says, "The rounded world is fair to see, 9-time folded in mystery, though baffled seers cannot impart the secret of its laboring heart. Throb thine with nature's throbbing breast, and all is clear from east to west. Spirit that lurks each form within, beckons to spirit of its kin. Self-kindled, every atom glows, and hence the future which it owes." In other words, to quote Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, passage 48, "To cast an eye or show a bean in its pod confounds the learning of all time." In other words, there are moments when you meet nature and you cannot help but be blown away. And you're going to ask some fundamental questions about what it means to engage, to look at, to participate in any way with the world of nature. Ruthie's tree comes to mind again. He begins it this way, the essay. There are days which occur in this climate, at almost any season of the year, wherein the world reaches its perfection, when the air, the heavenly bodies, and the earth make a harmony. That's a key word for Emerson's thought, harmony. As if nature would indulge her offspring, when, in those bleak upper sides of the planet, nothing is to desire that we have heard of the happiest latitudes, and we bask in the shining hours of Florida and Cuba, when everything that has life gives sign of satisfaction, and the cattle that lie on the ground seem to have great and tranquil thoughts. Now, of course, this is overstatement. We'll write it down at 2b. Emerson loves his hyperbole, his exaggeration, his overstatements. He says there are moments in the year when we are so blown away by the weather and the beauty of nature that even the cattle seem to be lying out there in a field thinking beautiful thoughts. What's he really saying? He's saying that the source of his optimism is born of an appreciation of nature. He will continue it. The knapsack of custom, he says, falls off his back, nature. And the first step he makes into these precincts here is sanctity, which shames our religion, and reality, which discredits our heroes. Here we find nature to be the circumstance which dwarfs every other circumstance and judges like a god all men that come to her. We've crept out of our close and crowded houses into the night and morning, and we see what majestic beauties daily wrap us in their bosom. Now this crept out of the close and crowded houses immediately makes us think about Plato's cave allegory, the idea that when we are uncertain and we are only in the world of belief and opinion, we're in the darkness of the cave. But then we come out of the darkness of the cave into the light of the sun, and then all of a sudden we begin to see things much differently. He will continue in paragraph 1 by saying it this way: the incommunicable trees, we think again of Ruthie's tree, the incommunicable trees begin to persuade us to live with them and quit our life of solemn trifles. Here, no history or church or state is interloped on the divine sky and the immortal year. How easily we might walk onward into the opening landscape, absorbed by new pictures and by thoughts fast succeeding each other, until, by degrees, the recollection of home was crowded out of the mind, all memory obliterated by the tyranny of the present, and we were led in triumph by nature. He continues, paragraph 2. These enchantments are medicinal. Now let's write this in our notes. Emerson will argue, sounding very much like Wordsworth in Tintern Abbey, okay, a text that we've lectured elsewhere at another time, that nature is restorative. Medicinal will be his term. In other words, when you are feeling crummy, a walk in the Badlands or a walk in the mountains is for you somehow restorative. It's medicinal. It's, by the way, why city engineers at the very beginning of American thought, we are obviously talking about American thought in its genesis when we're talking about Emerson and the influence of Emerson's ideas and others, right? Why in almost all cities you will find parks with trees planted. Now what's that all about? Emerson will argue we need these, especially in our cities, so that we can continue to be reminded of the things that matter, namely, of course, nature. These enchantments, he says, are medicinal. They sober and heal us. These are plain pleasures, kindly and native to us. We come to our own and make friends with matter, which the ambitious chatter of the schools would persuade us to despise. We never can part with it. The mind loves its old home as water to our thirst, as is the rock, the ground, to our eyes and hands and feet. It's firm water. It's an interesting idea. Rock. It's firm water. It's cold flame. What health and what affinity. Ever an old friend, ever like a dear friend and brother, when we chat affectedly with strangers, comes into this honest face and takes a grave liberty with us and shames us out of our nonsense. Cities give not the human senses room enough. We go out daily and nightly to feed the eyes on the horizon and require so much scope, just as we need water for our bath. So, in other words, in paragraph 2, he's already getting to his point. We have to be able to appreciate nature, to be reminded that there's something other than what's in the first box. You can't live your whole life simply trying to have money, for example. He'll say this later. Trying to acquire lots and lots of stuff. Because sooner or later, you've got to leave this world of the physical, and you can't take any of that with you. Therefore, it would make sense for Emerson, he says this is the heart of wisdom, to begin to already contemplate what does it mean to have to go bye-bye. As we have said many times, when they were teaching you this when you were quite young, I don't want to leave the park. No. You don't get to stay in the park. and swing forever. You got to go to the van. I don't want to go to the van. No. This is the whole point. This is what makes playing at the park and swinging so precious to us. Because sooner or later, we got to go to the van. See, they were teaching this to you when you were a child. It's just you were too young to appreciate it in its entirety. Now Emerson says is the time for you to begin to learn from nature the truth of what it means to be alive. Of course, to be alive is kind of almost like a euphemism in itself. You can be breathing and not alive if you are unaware of the important things in your life, ergo, your relationship with nature. Paragraph 3 continues, it seems as if the day was not wholly profane in which we have given heed to some natural object. He says, the fall of snowflakes in a still air, preserving to each crystal its perfect form. The blowing of sleet over a wide sheet of water and over plains. The waving rye field, the mimic waving of acres of histriona, and on he goes. In other words, he just starts kind of listing all of the amazing things that are involved in nature. Art, he says, and luxury have learned that we must work as enchantment and sequel to this original beauty. Let's write that down. He calls nature the original beauty, and everything else is kind of second to it, right? I am over-instructed for my return. Henceforth, I shall be hard to please. I cannot go back to toys. I am grown expensive and sophisticated. I can no longer live without elegance, but a countryman shall be my master of revels. He who knows the most, he who knows what sweets and virtues are in the ground, the waters, the plants, the heavens, and how to come to these enchantments is the rich and royal man. Somebody who, in other words, knows how to walk out into nature and enjoy nature is far richer than the millionaire who doesn't know anything about the world of nature. Only as far as the masters of the world have called in nature to their aid can they reach the height of magnificence. Paragraph 4, he continues, the moral sensibility, which makes Edens and Tempes so easily, may not be always found, but the material landscape is never far off.